There are stories that stay in the annals of a family history. They're told and retold, always with the same reaction. Such is the case with my dad and his home-brewed beer. I had come home from college between semesters. It was the usual event with little fanfare, just a regular college kid returning home for a bit. What wasn't usual was the discussion that was going on between my mom and dad about my dad's new enterprise, his making of home-brewed beer. My dad loved his beer and wasn't able to have it because of the cost all the time, so we decided to brew his own. My mother was a Southern belle and objected strongly to having any beer in the house, much less to have it home brewed by my dad. But my dad was not to be denied and went ahead with his brewing anyway. Our family lived in a 3-story house, so the beer was relegated to the basement out of the main part of the house. That at least made it more palatable for my mom. By the time I arrived home, Dad's first home brewed beer was almost ready. He was hardly able to contain himself. In the next few days, my dad deemed his first batch of homebrewed beer ready for consumption. My brothers and I were required actually, to give it a taste. My mom was not pleased, but she had resigned herself to the fact that it was to be. All I can say was my dad's first attempt at homebrewed beer was interesting. It was okay, but my dad was genuinely excited about the final product. He declared it a success. He went on to say how he knew that each batch would be an improvement, just a little bit more of this and that, and he knew he could make it perfect. My mom just sighed and rolled her eyes. Over the next week or so, he shared his beer with anyone who visited and who dared. The fact that my dad was so thrilled with his first batch of beer made it almost impossible for us not to join in his delight. As I left for college, he mentioned that the next time I would be home, he knew that he would have an even better batch. My mother rolled her eyes and grumbled uncomplimentary thoughts under her breath. I just chuckled and smiled at both my parents. In the next few months, I was back home for summer break. My dad's beer production was in full swing, and he had beer bottles everywhere throughout the basement in all stages of fermentation. After I'd settled in, Dad handed me a glass of his newest concoction. It wasn't bad. It was beer, but the alcohol strength was pretty high. Regardless, he was very pleased with himself. My mother had long since given up trying to remove the offending beer out of the house. She simply chose to ignore the whole affair. Dad's most recent batch was in its final stages of fermentation. He had bragged about having beefed up the yeast in the process. He was absolutely positive this would be his triumph and couldn't wait for it to be ready. It was night. It was late. And I was reading and thoroughly enjoying the fact they had no finals or classes to worry about over the next few weeks. I was thinking about my dad's homebrewed beer and how tomorrow was the day the beer was to be revealed. There certainly was a lot of it. Put the book away, turned off the lights, settled down to sleep when I heard a rumble. It was an unusual sound because our house was very close to the main road. This was different. It didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder. The house shook and rumbled. It felt as if the house was preparing to take off. All I could think of was, what the heck? As you can imagine, it woke the whole house. The rumble quickly climaxed into the sound of a final boom. That's when we noticed it. The smell. The unmistakable bouquet of a particularly strong beer. I went out into the hall. My mom and dad were there, and Mom was seriously not in a good mood. We made our way from the top of the house to the basement. As we descended, the smell of the beer grew stronger and stronger, and so did my mother's displeasure. Dad was pretty darn quiet. As we came into the basement, we stared at a jaw-dropping sight. The beer was everywhere. Glass, corks, crates were strewn all over the basement. One of my brothers looked up and pointed. The force of the explosion had blown the corks out of the bottles like rockets and embedded them in the ceiling. And I mean, there were corks everywhere. We couldn't help it. We started to laugh. Mom, even in her fury, couldn't help it and joined in. It took quite a while to clean up the mess from the beer explosion. Even longer to rid the house of the beer smell. It was a good thing it was summer, so that we could leave the windows open. Miraculously, a few bottles had actually been spared, and they were pretty darn good. But alas, that was the last of my dad's home-brewed beer enterprise. Not long after, Mama had decided it was okay for Dad to have his beer, but he was no longer allowed to make his own. Go figure. My brothers and I still laugh about the night the house took off in the cork-embedded ceiling.